speaker is Angela Walch. She is professor of law at St. Mary's University and in San Antonio, Texas, and a research fellow at the Center for Blockchain Technologies at University College in London. And she's going to present about blockchain intermediaries.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to get to meet people who I have been, following their research for a number of years now. So thank you for having me. And thank you to Peter particularly for having me, because we've had a lot of debates, and I'm excited to get to engage in some more of those hopefully today. So my presentation is called Intermediaries Who Must Not Be Named, a Legal and Policy Research Agenda for Crypto Miners. So I have been thinking generally about the parties within blockchain systems for a long time and how power is distributed among them, and what the implications are for that power distribution for conclusions that we might draw from a legal perspective, a policy perspective, and a regulatory perspective. Okay, so I'm going to put a few quotes up that demonstrate just how pervasive our characterization of these systems is, that we describe them as having no intermediaries, as lacking intermediaries. Okay, so that is not on. Okay. Blockchain creates the opportunity for frictionless, immutable transfers of information or value without an intermediary. This is from the Chamber of Digital Commerce Legislators Toolkit for Blockchain Technology. This organization is a lobbying organization for blockchain, the blockchain industry generally. Okay, I had a lot of quotes from Peter here, so not trying to pick on you, but this demonstrates this characterization. Okay, a system without intermediaries is a system without intermediary risk, and thus no need for regulation aimed at safeguarding against the types of risk presented by intermediaries. Right? If we characterize these systems as lacking intermediaries, we immediately begin to draw risk and policy and legal conclusions based on that. Okay, so this was just in a blog that Peter wrote talking about Bitcoin and Libra differences. Okay, here's a quote from Alice Morkos, who is the founder of Chaincode Labs, one of the companies that sponsors Bitcoin developers. Yes, miners should act as if they don't have agency and are automata. We people who make up the community should use social means to encourage that. I draw your attention to they should act as if. Okay, here's some more from Peter. New and emerging company architectures can help forge trustworthy relationships directly between users without intermediaries. The most visible of these new systems thus far is Bitcoin. So this is, Peter testified, went up against Nouriel Roubini last year in Congress, and this was part of his testimony. Okay, and then this is a lot. But this is an excerpt from a letter to the Securities and Exchange Commission sent by one of the lawyers for Blockstack. This was a company that did an S1, I believe they registered with the SEC. They were the first company to actually do a registration statement with the SEC for their tokens, rather than going kind of this.
Reg A+.
Was it Reg A+? That's what it was. Thank you. So in communications with the SEC, this is how their lawyer characterized miners. The miners do not act as intermediaries in making payments or deliveries. By the time they're involved in confirming and recording transactions, the transactions have already occurred, other than being recorded, without any involvement by the miners. The miners are doing no more than implementing mechanical tasks that are used to confirm those transactions occurred. Okay? Nor do they stand between any transaction participants. They generally don't know who the parties are, what assets are involved, where participants are, anything else that would let them play an intermediary role. Okay? So all of these characterize these systems as lacking intermediaries and talk about how miners are not intermediaries in these transactions. Okay, I think this is not a great characterization of these systems, and I think it actually has really important consequences. So Today I'm going to argue that viewing systems, blockchain systems, as ones without intermediaries is actually quite misleading and very consequential for a variety of reasons. Okay, so I'll talk about how I actually see miners as intermediaries within these systems, and I'll tell you why and how I'm characterizing intermediaries in that way. I'll give you examples of ways that I have seen just watching the crypto space of miners acting as intermediaries, and highlight some computer science research that emphasizes this. If I have time, I'm going to tease out some of the assumptions that people are making when we describe blockchain systems as lacking intermediaries. I have a feeling that from my conversations with people, it seems like people are comfortable describing blockchain systems as having no intermediaries because of certain analyses that they're kind of doing silently, to where they're comfortable saying, well, we should treat them as if they have no intermediaries because of these conclusions that I have not articulated. Okay, and then finally, I think there's actually a lot more research that is needed in this area, and it's research about the mechanics of blockchain systems that is probably going to come from computer scientists and economists, but all of this research very much implicates legal conclusions and policy conclusions. So I think it all has to work together. So I'm going to lay out some open research questions that I think are essential for us to better understand this. Okay, so first of all, what am I talking about when I'm using the term intermediary? This is a very inflammatory word, I have learned in discussing this in various contexts. And all I am using this word to mean is the most basic lay definition, okay? An intermediary is a middleman, right? It's someone who is between me and you that I have to go through if I want to get to you, okay? So it's a party you have to go through to accomplish something. I'm not using an intermediary in a way that is a legal term here. I'm not using it in the sense of financial intermediation, which is the term used to describe kind of what banks do, right? When they transform obligations in a way through their magic. I'm not talking about that. I'm simply talking about someone is in the middle. Okay? I'm also not talking about the intermediaries who are outside of blockchain systems. Right? We're comfortable talking about exchanges and wallet providers as intermediaries. I'm not talking about them. Also, in this conversation, I'm not talking about non-mining nodes. I'm specifically focusing on miners, although I think that we should be asking similar questions about nodes, but I haven't gotten there yet. Okay, so my definition of intermediary, a very basic lay definition, middleman. Sure, yes.
Are you saying, is your definition there essentially scoping it purely to miners, or are there things that fit your definition of intermediaries that are not miners?
Within these systems? This paper is really about miners here. So nodes may, I have not thought through it yet. Nodes may also end up falling into this category for me, but I haven't done the deep thinking about that yet. So this paper is me thinking about miners as intermediaries. Okay, why do I think about miners as intermediaries?
Another quick follow-up.
Sure.
So is it, when you talk about miners, is it the same as validators in like proof of stake blockchain systems?
Okay, great. Yeah, that's going to be another important definitional issue, absolutely. I'm focusing in this paper primarily on Bitcoin, and I'm using the term miners because that's all over the literature. It's very tricky, I agree with you. I think that parties that we're referring to as validators or record keepers, bakers potentially, right? I'm really interested in the people that are actually writing to the blockchain, the people who have the ability to create the record. My discussion will primarily be focused on Bitcoin, but I think a lot of these points that I'll make extrapolate to other systems, to the record keepers in them.
And how do you make the distinction between, for example, pools and workers in the pools?
Yep, right.
I'm thinking you're referring probably to the pool manager.
I think the pool managers are the most obvious ones here. This is going to have to be taken apart, but and I know there is a lot of experimentation, and there are proposals to help to take back some of the power from pool operators, particularly in Bitcoin. So that absolutely will play into the analysis. Okay, why am I thinking about miners as intermediaries? Well, these public blockchains occur on peer-to-peer networks, right? There is no central server. And I think that that's the main reason people are comfortable describing them as lacking intermediaries. And I think that it may have been pretty fair to characterize these systems as lacking intermediaries, maybe at the very beginning, okay? When you didn't have these big mining pools, discrepancies in power, a really stark divide between mining nodes and purely just validating nodes, non-mining nodes. So there's an important distinction here between different players on the blockchain, right? It's a peer-to-peer network, but only some of those parties actually get to write, okay? Not all the peers get to write to the blockchain. And you don't get to put your transaction on the blockchain, on the ledger, unless a miner puts it there, okay? So I see them as this middle party, right, that each peer has to go through in order to actually get their transaction on the ledger, okay? If a miner can affect things about your transaction, maybe the time it's actually processed or the order in which your transaction gets processed, then they can affect you, right? They stand in the middle between you getting your transaction on the ledger, and they may be able to do things about it. We'll talk about some of the things that they can do in a moment. Thus, this puts them in the middle, and if they're in the middle, they may pose a middleman kind of risk. And I think that this is really important because if we just kind of habitually characterize the systems as lacking intermediaries and don't appreciate the middleman risk posed by miners within them, then our risk analyses are flawed, the conclusions that we draw are flawed, the policy decisions that we make based on those analyses are flawed, legal conclusions are flawed, etc. So I think a lot more research is necessary here. Okay, so what can miners do as intermediaries that we might worry about? That we might think, well, if they could do this, maybe they do pose some kind of risk to me as I'm trying to get my transaction to another party. All right, we've seen that, right? They can rewind transactions if they get a certain amount of hashing power on the network, right? We saw transactions rewound following the DAO. You had to have a certain amount of miners involved with this. We saw great discussion in the Bitcoin ecosystem after the big Binance hack happened, right? On Twitter, a software developer proposed, well, why don't you just bribe the miners? They suggested to the head of the exchange that he should just bribe the miners to undo the hack, right? And this was viewed as kind of, he said the unsayable thing, right? You can't, that's not true, right? Bitcoin is immutable, so you can't even admit that someone could choose to roll back the transaction, but it would be miners making the decisions there about whether that happened.
I feel like he said something silly, not unsayable. I think people who I look to in the community as reasonable felt that what was being proposed was absurd. Not that it was unsayable, but that it was never going to work. And indeed, it didn't, not even remotely.
Right, they didn't attempt it, right? But, I don't know.
It's a matter of
interpretation of public statements. Absolutely.
And then with the DAO fork, important to note that there is a chain where those transactions were not rewound.
Absolutely.
So both existed, and it was merely the choice of users to use one chain or the other that actually was influential. Because if Ethereum as forked without the DAO transactions was simply not interesting to users, it would have traded lower than Ethereum Classic. In fact, the reverse was true. To me, it was the users, by preferring to trade Ether rather than Ether Classic in the long run, because we look at the difference in price, that actually made the choice to rewind that transaction.
Okay. Yeah, I think that there is a really important larger conversation that needs to happen here about this power of users, this user-activated soft fork, and this ties into the larger conversation about are users protected purely through having the right to, like fork off, right? Exit versus voice.
But more
go ahead.
fundamental is the question, did the miners reverse the transaction or the users? Metaphysically, I don't think you can actually say either is entirely true.
Okay.
It was a large community decision.
Okay.
Not
Yes.
something that,
Yes.
where an intermediary who you must trust made a choice for you.
Okay. Yeah, that's something that I want to talk about here is how much control does the intermediary have to have in order for us to consider them relevant and posing a risk, right? Does it have to be absolute control, or does it have to be some control in the matter, right? So yeah, that's kind of on my list. I think Primavera had her hand up.
I think it's a bit unfair to say that miners can rewind the transactions, and I think it goes back to the question between miners and validators.
Okay.
I would say that if you, like, the fork is actually not the miners, it's the validators. They decide which to go to.
Mm-hmm.
The miners can censor transactions, but I think that's not fair to say that they can rewind them.
Well, okay, so this actually also goes into the conversation about
I think if you have like a soft fork, then miners actually have the power to decide. But if it's a hard fork, it will be to the validators.
okay, that may be a fair point. I'm not sure I want to give on it, but I'll take your point, and can we discuss it further in a moment? Okay, one more.
So, the way I see it, we definitely still have these intermediaries. We just put them in this competitive market setting. And what Peter's basically saying is, they're driven by market forces. They can choose to ignore them, but at their own loss, right? They'll suffer a loss for that.
Mm-hmm.
So I can see kind of both sides of the
Yes.
argument.
Yep.
Right? Of course, they still pose a systemic risk if they band together and somehow perfectly do this, but usually they are affected by market forces and
Yeah.
will sway with the tide of either Ethereum Classic or not.
Right. The theory is that the game theory keeps them in check, and their economic incentives do as well.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying? Yep. Yeah, that's one of the items on my research agenda. Absolutely. Like, how far can we trust the game theory, right? Does game theory do everything for us that we would expect legal and regulatory actions otherwise to do? I'm not sure that we have enough certainty in the game theory yet to make that to say that that's great. That's a conclusion that we draw now. And of course, this always comes with the caveat of, in what way are you seeing these systems used, right? Are you seeing them used in a systemically important way for socially important practices, or are you just seeing them used in a kind of walled garden? People opt into them on their own. How many links are there to the existing financial system and the other parts of the non-crypto world? Okay, ordering transactions to their benefit. Miners, and here it's my understanding is the mining pool operators, right, choose what order they want to put transactions in to the blocks. And as we see in the financial markets more generally, deciding what order things happen and the timing of certain financial events can have huge consequences, right? The system can be gamed by manipulating ordering. And Phil Diane and others at Cornell wrote an important paper, Flash Boys 2.0, which you have probably all seen, that talked about how the layering of other systems on top of the base layer can change the incentives of the miners within the base layer and enable them to manipulate the system in certain ways. Okay, maybe they can censor transactions. So there was an example of this potentially happening in Zcash a number of months ago when it was discovered that one of the main miners didn't have nearly as many of the shielded transactions that it was mining as it should have, given its participation level in the blockchain. So there was some speculation that, oh, maybe they're deliberately choosing not to process shielded transactions, which if every miner made that decision, well, that kind of means that no shielded transactions are getting processed, and that kind of undermines the confidentiality, privacy goals of the system. So from Twitter again, some conversations on Twitter, the mining pool operator said, oh, it wasn't intentional that I was doing this. I just hadn't taken the trouble to implement the software the proper way to process those. So it was just me being lazy and not me being deliberate. Of course, this highlights the fact that there's absolutely choice involved here, and if lots of miners did that, then how would the confidential transactions end up on the blockchain? It's also important, the censoring point, in our discussion that we're having about control versus maybe like influence here, that do they have to be able to censor something indefinitely before we actually care? Or is it only censoring it, a little bit? Even if it's not indefinite, I think it actually matters a lot, because the idea with these blockchain systems is that you don't have anyone in the middle. You can get your financial transactions processed without having to have someone make a decision in the middle. Okay, and this kind of refers to the research that's happening generally about how adding layers above these core protocols alters the incentives, as I said, at the protocol level, and may give the miners additional opportunities to exploit their intermediary role. And I didn't list all the research here. I was kind of rushing on the slides, but there are quite a number of papers that have come out recently on this, and I can get the list for anyone who is interested. How does this matter? Okay. Well, I think our conclusions that we draw from a legal and a regulatory and a policy perspective flow from our understandings about the facts within these blockchain systems. If we view these systems as lacking intermediaries, and there's actually some really important people in them acting as middlemen and shaping what ends up on the blockchain, exploiting different opportunities that they have based on their role as writers to the blockchain, then we need to consider them in our legal, regulatory, and policy decisions. And right now, I think a lot of the decisions that are being made in this area view these systems as lacking intermediaries. Okay, so go ahead.
I have a question. We want to view, if we view the system completely as running code without human intervention,
Yeah.
then there is no intermediaries. Would you agree with this?
No.
Why not?
Because people are making choices to run code, to craft code, and yeah, go ahead.
We have these things that, that I knew it exists, but I didn't know that it's so pervasive that, okay, we can have a blockchain that we agree what will be the mining rule, and with a block there will be a certificate or a knowledge proof that this code was created by running this block was created by running this code that we agreed on. So there is no cheating, and essentially no human intervention aside from the decision to run the code or not to run the code. So we can, in some way, completely automate the system.
From my perspective, what I watch is these systems are not completely automated, right? Yeah, and I would be skeptical. Of course, I'm not a computer science scientist, but I would be skeptical that you can get to that point where it is a completely automated system. I think that humans tend to find the spots where things give them an opportunity to manipulate. And I see these systems as attempting to shut down as many of those opportunities as possible, but they still exist, and I think humans find those. So I would be skeptical that we'd actually get there.
Eli,
Yeah.
why can't we build a system that will, here is a block and a certificate that I didn't use selfish mining. The moment I found it,
I want to answer.
in other words, what can you prove, what can you not prove?
Can you prove that they didn't get a...
Proving that you did not do something is very hard, nearly impossible.
Right, are you just going to take the miner's word for it that I didn't get a bribe off-chain to process things a particular way? I'm not sure that you can reach those kind of actions.
There are
But
many choices in how you mine that are not provable by code. You can choose to delay messages, which is the essence of selfish mining, this delaying messages and not sending them out. This is something you couldn't prove that you've done or didn't do. Because it's outside of your computer, right? You could choose where to connect. You could choose who to connect to and who not to connect to. And so I would even look at relay networks as intermediaries that are possibly far more centralized than the miners themselves.
Okay.
Right? You could choose a lot of things, right? The algorithm also. You could say, I didn't see that last block, and so I did act according to code. So you can always restrict information, pretend as if you didn't receive messages, right? So there's no way to prove the correctness of your behavior if the input is manipulated by the miner externally.
okay.
Good answer.
Okay, so I think we're in many ways making decisions based on the view that miners do not act as intermediaries. And just a few examples of this, right? Miners are not treated as money transmitters by FinCEN, which is the part of the Treasury Department that deals with money laundering around the world and has rules for how banks have to police money laundering. So they're not treated as money transmitters there. The New York BIT license affirmatively doesn't cover miners. It's a pretty, it's viewed as, I would say, pretty controversial when people suggest that miners are functioning in ways that are very similar or analogous to parties in the financial system like brokers or people involved in the clearing of transactions, et cetera. It's very controversial still to suggest those things. There are signs that the tide may be shifting. I believe it was last fall, OFAC, who maintains a list of parties you can't do business with because they're suspicious, right? You can't send money to these people. They put some Bitcoin addresses on that list. And I would think that the only way that could be enforced is if miners are not supposed to be sending transactions from or to those addresses. Okay. So I'm just going to put up a whole bunch of questions up here. Jason.
The previous slide, are you suggesting that the miners should be treated or FinCEN, or you don't have a stance on that?
Well, this paper is not taking a stance on it, but I think that if we take a deeper look at what miners are doing, then we need to be willing to go where that leads us and potentially rethink a lot of regulatory and legal classifications that we've made based on this belief.
I understand the position. However, I think it was a self-conscious decision by the New York Department of Financial Services to not regulate miners. Now you're suggesting that they made that decision with bad information.
Yes.
With respect to FinCEN, we haven't had new law here since Bitcoin.
Right.
The laws that apply are much older. And FinCEN offered guidance in 2013 and again in 2019 explaining how they see those old laws, the way they were written back before Bitcoin, fitting or not fitting into cryptocurrencies.
Right.
So FinCEN was bound because they can't create new law, They can make new regulations,
Right.
and they chose
Yes.
not
Yep.
to faithfully interpreting the letter of those old rules.
Mhm.
And I mean, Coin Center and others suggested, look, a plain reading of the rules suggests that you're only a money services business for purposes of FinCEN if you accept and transmit currency substitutes from one person to another or one location to another. And a plain reading of accept and transmits suggests at least transitory custody over a financial asset, over a currency or a currency substitute. And I think we made in good faith an argument that a miner, though they may be, in the plain language, an intermediary, they are not accepting and transmitting from one person to another, one location to another.
No,
They're not
I
doing
agree
what-
that your argument was made in good faith. Absolutely, absolutely.
And so, I think it's fair to say that how we describe these things as intermediaries or not may color those decisions, but I don't think in the case of FinCEN that was the case. I think FinCEN has a lot of good information about this. The New York Department of Financial Services, I won't argue does or does not. I don't know them as well. FinCEN had good information and made a good call on the letter of the law. And they have the power, the Secretary of Treasury has the power to add a new category of financial institution and define it however they like. So they could potentially define miners as financial institutions. We would argue that that's a step too far, but
Right. That's a policy
I think they were
choice.
misled by a previous understanding of the.
So in the different reports from regulators that I cite in the paper, it's a pervasive characterization of these systems as miners are not intermediaries. There are no intermediaries within these.
They're not asking whether they're intermediaries. They're asking if they accept and transmit.
Yes, and this is not the argument that I'm really interested in having today, but sorry. But I think that you could, right, the questions around, like, what does it mean to hold this asset, right, and to transmit the asset, you're right, they may not be in perfect alignment with our existing categories, but I think that underlying it, they are doing something that people can't transmit their value, right, unless they go through them. So you could argue, right, that they are doing the transmission of value because it is their cementing the transaction in the blockchain that achieves the transmission.
Just transmit, but it's accept and transmit.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, we haven't heard from you, so.
In an earlier slide, you said by intermediary, it's sort of a
Yeah.
natural notion, something in between, and you
Yes.
disclaimed the notion that you were claiming
Yes.
a close analogy to conventional financial intermediaries.
Sure.
I think maybe, and then in this slide, you're sort of slipping in that direction a little bit.
Yes. Yeah.
I think maybe a question, I think we can all agree that in some sense, miners or nodes in general are intermediaries. You have to go through them to get
Okay.
to the network in that broader sense.
Yeah.
But one way to frame the issue is, should we think of them as more like financial intermediaries, or should we think of them as more like ISPs, who are also, for the same transaction,
Absolutely. Absolutely.
you can't get on the internet, you can't get
Yes.
on
They're gates, right?
So we don't think that like FinCEN should regulate ISPs. So where in that spectrum do they lie?
Right, absolutely. I think that's part of the research agenda. I can't remember if I added it to my list of questions or not, but questions around like network neutrality and antitrust and collusion issues, those absolutely need to be thought about in the context of the actual facts about the blockchain.
So you bring up OFAC in that next bullet point.
Yeah.
I think the OFAC list is a list of sanctioned.
Who is OFAC, if you can?
The Office of Foreign Asset Control. It's a division of Treasury that enforces U.S. sanctions. It says if a bank makes a transfer to a person in Iran who's on the sanctions list, which if they're in Iran they probably are, the bank is going to be responsible for it. And so OFAC decided to add some Bitcoin addresses to that list. Now they say if you make a transfer to this Bitcoin address, you're responsible. OFAC applies to both individuals who initiate the transfer, potentially to miners, I think absolutely to miners in fact, who put the transfer in the blockchain, but it also would apply to an ISP. A Bitcoin transaction message is not encrypted. The destination of the signed transaction message, the Bitcoin address, is viewable to the ISP if they do packet sniffing, if they look at it. And so I think actually this is very interesting. I haven't thought about this. An ISP probably
Yeah.
is liable if they relay a Bitcoin transaction message with an address on it that is on the sanctions list.
Yeah. That I think there is something there with that packet sniffing analogy, and well, I'm kind of jumping ahead here to the research agenda, but I think part of the empirical research that I am proposing, and I would guess that much of this is already going on, but I just haven't found it all yet, is that we need to be thinking carefully about, what can miners tell about the identity of parties who are transacting on the blockchain, right? The messaging around it is that, this is all automated, so no one's going and checking and stuff. But if we have companies like Chainalysis and those who are doing forensics and can identify with pretty good certainty, I don't know what the thresholds are, but have figured out how to identify parties behind different transactions in a number of situations, well, why wouldn't we assume that miners would use that same kind of technology to identify who is behind what addresses if it's beneficial to them, if they're taking bribes or whatever, to order transactions a particular way, et cetera, manipulate the blockchain a particular way. So I think we need a lot of empirical work on how miners operate. I think they have just not gotten the scrutiny yet. So I think we need to look at, this is the lawyers, contracts of mining pools. What kind of power are these hashers giving to the mining pool operator? Do they get to choose everything? Are you doing that research? Did I miss your presentation or something?
I was questioning exactly the same things when
okay.
was
okay.
presentation, which I assume that it's incredible that they just enter a program and a software and they start mining without being aware of what they are doing. And I think the advance goes back to the previous slide. While you were talking about miners and the idea, which I follow, to deem them responsible, but I wonder for what? Because except for the last clue that came up, that we can have a list of Bitcoin addresses, like a blacklist, as it was for bank account. This idea, I'm not sure, but this is my technological lack, if they can see the provenience of the money, if they are legal and whatever. So as long as we don't have any control into the merit of the transaction, would they be responsible? What for?
Mm-hmm.
Because as far as I understood, miners are just good guys able in computer, with very deep skills in computer, but they don't have any clue of what they are mining. So responsibility, yes, I agree, but what for?
Mm-hmm. So that's why I think this research is so incredibly important, right? How easily can miners pierce, right, the anonymity of parties transacting on the blockchain? I have a lot of questions about them, right? So I just mentioned the contracts of the mining pools and what the power is that the pool operator has versus the different hashers within the pool. So miners are important in the context of like bug fixes and software upgrades. What kind of vetting are they doing of the software before they upgrade, right? So in the Bitcoin inflation bug of the fall of 2018, right, we get the description in the bug report, the CVE whatever number, that the core developers contacted Slushpool, and Slushpool, like within a number of minutes, confirmed that they had upgraded. Did they vet this, right? The conversation is such that these systems are so incredibly complicated that you have to have unbelievable expertise in how they work and the history and all the interconnections of the software before anyone can actually be trusted to make changes to the code. But the miners are apparently taking, software, the core dev's word that just run this. It doesn't suggest to me that they've done any vetting. What are their cybersecurity practices, right? Who knows, right? I've heard anecdotally from people that they're not great, right? But it could matter from my perspective if, their cybersecurity practices are exploited to knock significant amounts of computing power off the system. We don't know what they're doing to protect against that. Does off-chain bribing happen, right? There's been a lot of theoretical, different types of bribing attacks proposed in the computer science literature. I don't know how you would ever find this out, but it would be great if we could know if it's really happening or not. Maybe someone needs to go undercover as an ethnographer and go and check. I don't know. If anyone has ideas on that, that'd be great.
Bribing, like, I mean, we call it bribing, it sounds illegal, but is it actually illegal to bribe minors? So, like, it sounds like it shouldn't be.
Bribing does, yeah, you're right, have that connotation.
I like my transactions privileged.
Yes, yeah, right. And I'm picking up on the term that is used in these computer science papers, but you're right. Should it be characterized as bribing or not? Are there off-chain?
Bribed.
No, you're right, right. Are there payments outside the system that are not reflected on the blockchain that you have accepted to process transactions, right? Because we know the ones that show up on the ledger, right? The transaction fees that are attached to the different proposed transactions, but we don't know about stuff that's not on the ledger. How? Yeah.
I mean, for deviating from the consensus protocol, not for.
It's that narrow? I'm sorry.
When we say bribing, we commonly mean something that affects the consensus protocol, not prioritization of transactions.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
That still is an issue, right? Prioritization of transactions. If you prioritize someone's transaction, you're basically circumventing the market forces, right? You're not allowed.
The market is not enclosed in the, yeah.
Like I have an exclusive a contract with someone that I'll clear all their transactions. Nobody else gets to compete, so I'm somehow making more money as a result.
Economically, we refer to these as side payments, right? There's a conventional arrangement that is sort of the institutionally sort of common and accepted way of doing things, and then parties engage in side payments. And there are some circumstances in which side payments are extremely beneficial. Cozy bargaining is the famous one, but some circumstances in which there's supposed to be an incentive structure and the side payments are not so beneficial. And then
yeah. Right, because all the incentive structure baked into these blockchains and why we would be comfortable potentially saying that we don't have to worry about the legal and regulatory stuff because people's behavior is constrained by the incentives designed and baked into the system. Well, if these kind of things happen outside the system, that affects that entire analysis, right? How are the different mining pools connected in the real world? I mean, there's speculation about there's one guy behind X number of mining pools, but I would like to know that because I think it's absolutely relevant in figuring out people's ability to actually manipulate the transactions on the ledger.
So just with respect to bribing, so maybe over time this problem will actually become better, just like less bribing, because if block Bitcoin or other cryptocurrency is more widely adopted and then makes those traditional legacy payment system less used, the cost of doing any side payments become larger. So the economic incentives just push toward people not doing any side payments or bribing. Just it's so costly to do it off-chain, transactions.
Why is it costly to do it off-chain? I don't.
So, like for example, so now so many billions of people are using payment network, or say credit card payment networks. But now suppose that just the blockchain payment has become to a point that everybody is adopting, so few people are using those legacy payments anymore, and companies are exiting the market, and it becomes just like, say, for example, you go to Sweden and people say they're trying to cancel cash. Right? If cash really gets canceled, you can imagine it's really difficult for young people to do cash transactions.
You don't actually have to do it off-chain, right? You can pay side payment using Bitcoin. It just won't be as part of the, say...
It won't show up on the record as tied to those transactions.
It's probably then better not to say off-chain side payments. It's better to say not part of fees for transactions.
Right, neither transaction fee nor block reward. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. They do use fees,
right?
In the sense like I bribe you to roll back by putting something a huge fee, right? That is on.
Yes. Yeah.
Then how is it different really just from putting that into transaction fees? Economic essence should be the same.
No, because it's not. There's no competition. You're not offering other miners a chance to get that payment, right? As fees do.
Yes. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I think if we start to view miners like, as part of this critical infrastructure, right? If this was a bank, right, the regulator would come and say, you need redundancy in communication, you need redundancy in backups for data, and so on.
Yeah.
My fear is like miners are there trying, or pools maybe are there trying to save costs, so they're not building up necessarily all the redundancy you'd want.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so that's where the market is leading them.
Yeah.
On the other hand, workers who come to the pools, right? There's an information problem. You don't know how much redundancy your pool has actually purchased. You can see how much you're paying them in fees, for example, what percentage you're leaving them, but you have no idea how robust they are, and usually you don't care. And so if we think of this as systemic risk, right, cybersecurity practices are part of this payment that mining pools have to keep expending. Really what you want to do is just regulate this as if it was critical infrastructure of any sort, right, the power grid and so on.
Yeah.
That's one approach.
Yeah.
The problem is, right, it's distributed around the world, it's, right,
Mm-hmm.
if you would. So, not necessarily just to stop transactions from going to places we don't like. I'm not sure that's the right way to regulate payments. That could be done at exchanges right now, or right entry into the conventional banking system. And I think
They're different questions. There's like the cheating, consumer protection cheating question versus the systemic stability question.
Right.
Yeah.
So obviously, Bitcoin now is not of systemic consequence for the world economy.
Mm-hmm.
But we might get there, and then I think some of these things would be worrying,
Mm-hmm.
right? So maybe that's an interesting question.
Yeah. Okay. What else is on here? Okay, so I know research is beginning on this, but I think this is absolutely critical. How do the upper layers, the interactions between the upper layers and the base layer affect these miner incentives and opportunities? And this is, interesting because all of this DeFi structure is being built up atop Ethereum, and I know that there are efforts to do similar things in Bitcoin, and right, that's part of the vision now, is that there are these upper layers. There are also lots of financial products that people are proposing that are not like in the DeFi area, but are in the more legacy financial system area, right? We've got futures products. There's the CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission chair predicted recently that you would see Ethereum futures in, I think he said 6 months or something like that. And then there's also speculation about a Bitcoin ETF being imminent, okay? How do our understandings of these systems change and the risks embedded in them once all these upper layers are built on? Okay, so this is, here's a few questions that try to get at, why are we comfortable describing these systems as lacking intermediaries, okay? One of the arguments that I see people making to say, you're crazy when you characterize them as intermediaries, is because it's not a single party who is always the intermediary, right? You don't know who the miner is going to be that is going to process your transaction. You can't identify them in advance, right? It's the idea that they win this lottery, and even if they have, a certain huge percentage of the hashing power, right, they're not guaranteed 100% to be the winner. So do we understand these risks? Are they different kinds of risks posed by intermediaries? Kind of hard to say, but I like it. Are those different risks than our more standard intermediaries, right? I think people have become comfortable saying, well, they're not intermediaries because they're intermittent. I think we need to press harder there. Okay, have we actually just broken up this intermediary, this one central intermediary, into multiple intermediaries and pieces? Do we need to think about obligations that each miner as a potential intermediary to come in for a second and act as an intermediary? We have to grapple with that. We haven't thought through that question yet, at least from the research that I have done. Does an intermediary need control to be considered? That seems to be an underlying assumption and conclusion that people are drawing, right? That if they can't force people to upgrade their software, that they can't censor a transaction forever, right, then it's not fair to call them intermediaries. They don't look the same way. Well, they might just be a different kind of intermediary, and maybe intermediary isn't even the right word here, but I feel like because of these vocabulary issues, we're glossing over some of these important questions. And then this is the question that you were just talking about. Should miners be viewed as critical infrastructure providers? Do they now view themselves this way? From, anecdotal conversations that I've had, no, they don't seem to. But as the systems grow, do we need to treat them in this way? Here's more. Is the game theory embedded in blockchains robust enough to replace legal and regulatory structures, right? This question has already come up in our conversation today, right? Do we trust that these economic incentives that are being designed into the systems, that those really work well enough to where we can say, you don't have to worry about governing these people through legal or regulatory means. The economic incentives do everything. I'm very skeptical. Okay. I think, this empirical research and these other theoretical questions that I have asked lead us to have to potentially rethink existing legal conclusions that we've drawn about these systems, right? Because I'm not sure that we have understood them well enough to, or those conclusions that we drew in the past, right? The systems have changed in important ways over time. They're evolving. So maybe these conclusions are, need to be rethought, right? We've mentioned, are they money transmitters? Are they transfer agents? Are they brokers? And are they fiduciaries, potentially? But I don't know. Can miners engage in insider trading, right? Is that what they're doing if they take side payments to prioritize a particular transaction, or if they get inside knowledge like the first miner slush pool who heard about the Bitcoin bug, right? Can they engage in insider trading if they exploit that knowledge in some way, right? That knowledge that they got before other miners or before the regular nodes. Should miners have to meet governance and risk standards that we impose on other financial market infrastructure? This was the question that was asked earlier as these systems become more important. Could miners be regulatory access points to do things like anti-money laundering checks to help to stop thefts from exchanges? Right now, I've been in conversation with people who are doing these forensics, and they talk about how they look at the flows of the money after an exchange has a theft, and talking about, well, tell other exchanges not to process transactions that have come from there, but could you stop it at the miner level and say, miners, you can't send that money that's been stolen on? Okay, there are more. I didn't have time to put all the principles that should guide this research, but there are some important ones that have been highlighted by various people in the audience already, right? There are different roles performed by different actors within these mining ecosystems, okay? People who just contribute hashing power are different than mining pool operators, and there are a whole bunch, to my understanding, of different structures of these mining pools and cloud mining, and so any analysis has to take that into account. Each blockchain system is unique. Okay, we've been talking primarily about Bitcoin, but I think a similar analysis would be very useful, and similar research would be incredibly useful on all of these different blockchain ecosystems. The tech and the practices are fast moving and ever evolving. So stuff that you learn may not be useful for that long, and you'll have to continue updating to follow the tech. And that's where I've gotten to. I think there are lots of interesting questions here, so thank you, and happy to continue to discuss.
Maybe we have time for one question, and then we can take offline. We are running a little short.
Okay, great.
And I wonder, because we've been focusing on Bitcoin, there's sort of quite a lot of centralization. The miners, you can think of them as sort of the big farms with a lot of money. Mm-hmm. But you can think of systems, maybe the current systems all have the structure because they all are very similar technically, but the newer systems, some of them might have far more distributed. So I suppose instead of this few pools of giant miners, you would have 100,000 miners that are mostly small, just people doing on their home computer? Does that change their, like?
Oh, I think that certainly would change any legal and policy conclusions that you draw from the systems, right? I think that the important part is to see these people and to think about what kind of risk do they potentially pose, what actions can they take?
Take all the same actions, just more of them.
Yeah, so that question that I talked about, how do we think about an intermediary that has been just like fragmented, right? It's not gone, it's just broken into a million pieces. Do we impose the same obligations that the old one big intermediary had on every one of those fragments? Do we impose different obligations on them? This is kind of like, I don't have a conclusion there for you. I would think they would have fewer obligations because they pose fewer risks, right? It seems like it would be harder for them to control the ordering and like, I think the risks are different. So if the risks are different, your legal conclusions are different. Okay, thank you guys so much. I learned a lot already. Thank you.
We'll be back at 3, so it's a slight